to partner with Meharry Medical College. We have been partnering with the college all year, bringing in conversations about this virus. Tonight, specifically, we want to talk about the vaccine. And so before we get started, just a little housekeeping rules. First, I want to invite you to share this post and host a watch party on your own page. Perhaps there is a family member, a friend, a community member who's not tuned in tonight. But if you share it on your page, they will get this information. Beloved, I want you to know this is a communal conversation, and your individual decision about this vaccine will impact the community. So let's have a community conversation. So go ahead and host a watch party right there on your page. Also, I want to invite you during this conversation, you're invited to write comments and questions. And Dr. Hildreth will be answering questions later on this evening during the Q&A. And while all comments are welcome, difference of opinions are welcome, but this is sacred space, and we believe in radical hospitality. That is our way here at Scarritt Bennett Center. And so a difference of opinion does not mean hate or disrespect. So any comments or questions that reflect hate or disrespect will be deleted immediately. And lastly, I want to take this opportunity to introduce Dr. James Hildreth. Many of you already know who he is, but just for those who have not heard of Dr. Hildreth, Dr. Hildreth has transformed institutions and lives through a unique combination of skills, expertise, and passionate drive. He seeks to achieve organizational success by nurturing passion and developing confidence in others. Dr. Hildreth's enthusiasm and love for the work he does inspires others and draws them into bold vision and new direction. Because of his standing as a world-class infectious disease expert, excellent ability to explain complex science to laypersons, and engaging communication style, Dr. Hildreth has emerged as a respected national figure in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In September 2020, he was appointed to the FDA Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee that is reviewing COVID-19 vaccine candidates for approval. And finally, he currently serves as president and CEO of Meharry Medical College here in Nashville, Tennessee. We're grateful to have him tonight, and thank you, Meharry, for partnering with us. And now, Dr. Hildreth, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm James Hildreth, the president of Meharry Medical College. And tonight I'm going to talk about the biology of the virus, how the vaccines have been developed, and give enough background information so that I hope all of us can make an informed decision that will result in us taking these vaccines. So let's get started. I always start my talk by referring to Martin Luther King, who said of all the forms of inequality and injustice in healthcare is the most shocking. And I totally agree with that, and we need to view the pandemic in that context. So the virus that causes COVID-19 is called SARS-CoV-2, and it's a member of the coronavirus family. It's a large family of viruses. That's almost 40 members in that family. They're endemic to bats, but 7 of these viruses have an affinity for infecting humans. You may know that in 2003 and 2012, there were 2 other coronaviruses that caused pandemics around the globe. Some of these viruses, as you see on the right, have been circulating since the 1960s. These are viruses that cause a common cold. And because they are genetically similar, there's actually cross-reactivity between these viruses that belong to this family. You may have heard people talk about cross-reacting antibodies. This is the basis for that because they're all genetically related, which means that some of their proteins share similar sequences and shapes. One thing to know about coronaviruses that infect humans, the ones that cause pandemics are examples of what are called zoonotic infections. These viruses require an intermediate host, that are animals. And in the case of SARS, it was these small handheld pet privet cats. In the case of MERS, which happened in 2012, it was camels. So unless you came into contact with one of these animals that had the virus, you did not get infected. And these are great examples of zoonotic transmission. Another great example is avian flu or bird flu. When people come into contact with birds that have the flu virus, they get infected. And again, this is known as zoonotic transmission. The major difference between SARS and MERS is the following. There is still an animal vector that serves as an intermediate host, but once the virus gets into humans, SARS-CoV-2, something additional happened. That is, the virus adopted for human-to-human transmission. In other words, we became the vectors for this virus. We didn't need animal intermediates anymore. So the main difference between MERS, SARS, and SARS-CoV-2 is that we have become the vectors for this virus. And with international travel and people moving freely around the globe, that's why this virus spread so quickly around the globe, is because we, in fact, are the vectors for this virus. The other thing that's really, really important to know about the SARS-CoV-2 virus, it is a truly airborne pathogen. What that means is you don't need to sneeze or cough or expel droplets to transmit the virus. The particles are so small, they're less than 5 microns in size. That means that if you stand in the presence of someone, have a normal conversation for more than 10 or 15 minutes, you can acquire the virus. And that is one of the other differences between SARS-CoV-2 and other respiratory viruses, because it's truly airborne. It does not require coughing or sneezing. Just a normal conversation is sufficient to transmit the virus. And that is why all the focus has been on masks. Because, as you can see from this illustration, the infected asymptomatic person on the left at the top is able to transmit the virus to the two individuals on the left. But the one with the mask on has a much lower risk of getting infected by the virus. At the bottom, it shows you that if both people are wearing the mask, you have the minimum exposure, because whether you're the infected person who's exhaling the virus or the person who might inhale the virus, the cycle of transmission will be broken. And this is why masks are so very important in the case of SARS-CoV-2, because it is an airborne virus. Just want to speak briefly about the other thing that distinguishes this virus from some others is the spectrum of symptoms that are manifested when people get infected. One of those being the new loss of taste and smell really reflects this in a very dramatic way. There are few other infectious agents that we know of that can do this. But the point is that there are so many things about COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2 that are different from the other viruses that we deal with. And one of them is the broad spectrum of symptoms you may get. There are GI symptoms, vomiting or diarrhea, fever, chills, the usual cough, shortness of breath. But in addition to that, we have muscle aches and the loss of sense of smell and taste. The other thing that's really important to know about the SARS-CoV-2 is the spectrum of the types of infections that it can cause. And we can have pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic infections. On the far left, I just want to make the point that when the virus infects the upper airways, it can begin to replicate in the back of the nose and the back of the throat. And enough virus can accumulate to be transmitted. And that results in pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic infection. When the virus makes its way down into the lower respiratory tract, the lungs, we get the release of these chemical messengers called cytokines that cause lots of cells to come into the lungs. The inflammation is tremendous. And in fact, the response to the virus begins to do harm to the body just like the virus does. And that's because the virus is causing the release of these chemical signals that cause the immune system to really go crazy, go berserk. We got inflammation, we got cells. So that is why in the late phase of disease, we get the severe acute respiratory syndrome. And that's what SARS stands for, by the way. So let me just say a word about the pandemic, because this is very significant. In the span of 11 months, SARS-CoV-2 has eclipsed the total number of people that have died from HIV. Because the 75 million people that we know to be infected, we can multiply that number, because for every person who's diagnosed, there's probably at least 3 or 4, maybe more, who go undiagnosed. So it's very clear that in less than a year, this virus has infected way more people than has been infected by HIV, which has been a pandemic for 30 plus years. The other thing is that even though we represent less than 5% of the global population, the United States represents at least 20% or more of the cases and the deaths around the globe. And this is a very startling thing, that a country with 5% of the population has a fifth of all the cases and the deaths. And the reason for that is, just being quite honest, the pandemic has been handled poorly at the national level from the beginning. And part of that problem was that the agencies responsible for dealing with the pandemic were handcuffed by politics, and I will leave it at that. But in a counterweight to that has been that the scientific response, the global scientific community, has responded to this challenge in a way that we've not seen before. The other thing that's really, really encouraging and significant is we've had the kind of collaboration between pharma companies and public agencies that we've not seen before. And that is one of the things that has brought us to the point we are tonight, the fact that we've had this global scientific response and the collaboration between large organizations, including pharma companies. So the picture in the United States is not a pretty one. And as of December the 17th, we'd had more than 17 million cases of COVID-19 diagnosed. And keep in mind that most experts believe you should multiply that number by at least 4 to get the true number of people who've been diagnosed with COVID-19. We've also, on a trajectory, I think we've already passed this, of having more than 300,000 cases per day. Imagine 300,000 cases in a single day. And we've also eclipsed 3,000 deaths in a single day. So if we had a national strategy that involved testing, contact tracing, isolation, et cetera, on a national level, because viruses do not respect borders. They don't respect city borders, state borders, county borders. We needed a nationally coordinated response. And I personally believe that tens of thousands of lives could have been saved if we had that. So one of the things that we spent a lot of time thinking about with this problem is the fact that people with pre-existing conditions or comorbid conditions are much more likely to get really sick and to die from COVID-19. As a matter of fact, we knew this early on from China. China is a racially homogeneous nation, but even in China, if you smoked, were obese, had hypertension, asthma, any of those conditions, heart disease, you're much more likely to die. Unfortunately, those kinds of conditions are much more likely in minority communities in the United States. All of these things, asthma, obesity, cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, and that is why people of color around the country have been besieged by and much more burdened by disease and death in the United States. And as a matter of fact, these are data from July, but the picture has not really changed. As you can see, if you're black or African American, you were at least twice as likely to die from COVID-19. And if you drill down to certain states in the country, where you look at New Orleans, Detroit, and Chicago, as you can see, at one point in Louisiana, African Americans were 5 times more likely to die than whites were. Similarly, in Michigan, 10 times more likely, almost 10 times more likely. So clearly, people of color have been really, really disproportionately impacted by this virus compared to the majority population. And the reason is because of the health inequities and health disparities that exist in our country. So the way that we're going to get past the problem that we have, the pandemic, is through vaccines. And let me just speak a moment about herd immunity. Herd immunity is probably a concept you've heard about. It comes from agriculture from many decades ago, when they noticed that agricultural animals, when they got infected by a virus, at some point the infections and death would stop, and they noticed that the animals that remained alive had been infected and survived, and that concept of herd immunity emerged from that. And we know that depending on the virus in question, when 60 to 70% of people at least are immune to the virus can no longer spread rapidly through the population. We believe that for SARS-CoV-2, the number needs to be a bit higher than that. Perhaps 80% of people need to be immune to it to slow it down because of its transmission rate. But the bottom line is that we need vaccines to achieve herd immunity. But that means that vaccines must be demonstrated to work in all the vulnerable populations, older individuals, people with underlying conditions, people of color. All of those vulnerable populations need to be demonstrated to benefit from the vaccine. The other thing is that the vaccine trials themselves must include those persons to be absolutely sure that the vaccines will work. The human genome across all 7.5 billion of us are virtually identical, but there are subtle differences in our immune response genes that cause us to respond differently to different things. A great example of that is allergies. Allergies are a manifestation of immune responses. And consider the fact that African Americans are much more likely to have peanut allergies, for example, than whites are, and conversely, whites are much more likely to have allergies to animal dander than blacks are. And because we know that immune responses can be different, that is why we must demonstrate that the vaccine works in all those different populations, because you know immune responses are different. So how do the vaccines work? Well, if you think about how viruses infect cells, in the case of SARS-CoV-2, there's a protein called the spike protein or the attachment protein. It binds to a receptor on the surface of a cell, which is another protein. In this case, is the angiotensin converting enzyme number 2, or ACE2. After the spike protein binds to that protein, it changes its shape, and the virus fuses to the cell. There's attachment and then there's fusion. Both of those are mediated by the spike protein. What the vaccines are designed to do is to generate antibodies, as you see there. The antibodies bind to the spike protein, and they make a physical barrier between the spike protein and the receptor, and the infection is blocked. In other words, infection cannot occur because the attachment protein has been coated with antibodies that block its binding to the cell. So the vaccines that we are developing, that are being developed, are designed to create antibodies that will bind to the spike protein and keep the virus from infecting cells. So there are 3 types of vaccines that are being developed through Operation Warp Speed that I just want to share with you. So we call them platforms. There are 3 different platforms. So we're going to achieve the goal of these antibodies 3 different ways. At the top is a very traditional way of doing this. We take the spike protein itself from the virus. We mix that with an adjuvant to enhance its immunogenicity, or the immune response to it. We inject that directly into a person. So the immune system sees that protein, it's a foreign protein, and we get a response. That's the first platform. The second platform is also one that has been well studied, and it's actually kind of a clever platform as well. We take a common cold virus called an adenovirus. We cripple that virus so that it can go into cells but not replicate. So it's becoming a vehicle for delivery. But instead of the protein for the spike protein, we're putting the gene for the spike protein inside the common cold virus. So the common cold virus is going to deliver the gene for the spike protein into the cells. The cells then make that protein, and an immune response occurs. So we're using a common cold virus, we're modifying it genetically, so it's going to make the spike protein. The third platform, which is the one that Pfizer and Moderna have used, that have now been given EUAs, is to use messenger RNA. So I want you to think of it this way. The blueprint for all of our proteins are stored in our genes, and they're locked up safely inside of the nuclei of our cells. So those are the permanent blueprints for the proteins. The working blueprints for our proteins are called messenger RNAs. They're made from the master blueprint. They go into the cytoplasm of a cell, and then those proteins are made from that working blueprint. So what Moderna and Pfizer have done is they've taken messenger RNA, the blueprint for the spike protein, they're putting that into a lipid shell, they're injecting that into our body. The messenger RNA is taken up by muscle cells, and as a blueprint for that protein, the muscle cells will then make the spike protein because they have the blueprint now to make that protein. So all 3 of these platforms have the same result. The spike protein is delivered into our bodies so that the immune system can respond to it in 3 very different ways. One way we're using the actual protein. The second way is we're using a master blueprint for the protein, or the DNA. The third one, we're using a working blueprint, or the messenger RNA, for the protein. but all three of them have exactly the same result. Spike protein is made, immune response is made. So here just gives you a quick timeline of what has happened with these 6 companies. So 6 trials were to be initiated over a 5-month period. As you know, Moderna and Pfizer started first, so they're the first over the finish line. AstraZeneca started in August, Johnson & Johnson in September, and now Novavax and Sanofi are going to be doing their trials starting later this month or early next year. So Moderna and Pfizer are mRNA, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are modified common cold viruses, and Novavax and Sanofi are recombinant proteins. So those are the 3 platforms I described. So here's the way the study is designed. 30,000 to 40,000 people are enrolled in the study. Half of them get the placebo, half of them get the vaccine candidate. We then follow them for a period of time. And in the case of these 2 vaccines, there are 2 injections, either 21 days apart for Pfizer or 28 days apart for Moderna. Those participants are then followed to see who develops COVID-19. And what you're looking to see is whether or not the vaccine group gets many fewer infections or disease than the ones who got the placebo. That way we know that the vaccine is working. So let me just share with you what is in these vaccines, because I've heard people ask me about heavy metals and other things. Here's what's in these vaccines. This is the total list of what's being injected into your body. There's the modified mRNA itself. There's a mixture of lipids, including cholesterol. There's some inorganic buffer salts, sucrose, and water. That is what is in that vial that's being injected into your body. There are no preservatives. There are no heavy metals. There are no cellular products. There are no animal products. And one of the advantages of mRNA, it can be totally produced without any of these things. It is a chemical synthesis which makes the quality control and all of that much easier than when you're trying to use biological products. So again, no preservatives, no heavy metals, no animal products, no cellular products. That is the sum total of everything that's being injected into your body. Here's just a quick outline of what the study looks like. This is just a Moderna trial, but the Pfizer trial, much like this. I just want to point out that injections are given at day 1 and day 29. And then for 7 days after each injection, there's a journal that the participants keep to record the reactions to the vaccine. So after both injections, they're keeping a log of whatever symptoms they may develop after being injected. And as you can see, the plan is for these individuals to be followed for 2 years or more to make sure we can gather data about safety and how long the protection lasts. So both of these are 2-year studies to get the data we need to be assured of efficacy and safety. Let me just say a word about why you're getting 2 injections. The way the immune system works is the first time you see something in your body that's never been seen before, we make what's called a primary response. And you'll notice that the axis there that measures antibody concentration is a logarithmic scale, a 10-fold increase for each of those marks. I want to point out that when you get exposed the first time, over a period of about 3 or 4 weeks, you make a primary response. It's a decent response, but look at what happens the second time you get exposed. We get what is called a secondary response. It can be orders of magnitude greater than the primary response. As much as 100 to 1,000-fold more antibodies are made the second time around than the first time around. The other thing that's really important about a secondary response is we make lots and lots of what are called memory cells. The memory cells are responsible for the long-lasting immunity because the next time you see something, those memory cells can quickly expand and respond, and that's why you're getting 1 injection to induce a primary response. The second injection is to induce a secondary response, which gives you maximum protection. And this just shows you in a very dramatic way, profound way, just how well these vaccines are working. What we're doing here is we're getting the cumulative rate of COVID-19 cases measured in days after the time the injections are given. I just want to say that this is one of the best curves you could possibly hope for. The case of the vaccine is almost flat. But as you can see, for the placebo, the cases accumulate rapidly over this period of time. And this is probably the most dramatic demonstration possible of just how effective these vaccines are. And this is just a summary of the two mRNA vaccines. Both of them are mRNA blueprints for the spike protein. Both of them involve 2 doses, 21 days or 28 days apart. The viral efficacy, which is VE, is 95% for both of them. And as you can see, one of the things that's really, really important, both of these vaccines prevented severe cases of COVID-19. And that's a really, really important part of the excitement about these vaccines, is they limited severe disease, which means that they're going to save lives. So both of these vaccines have been reviewed by the FDA committee, and I sit on that committee where we spend a whole day going over the data, asking questions of both the sponsor, the company, and FDA, getting those questions answered. And in both cases, the committee decided that the benefits of the vaccines greatly outweighed the risk and recommended that the FDA recommend issue an EUA. There is a committee that at the CDC called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. They're responsible for making recommendations about how vaccines are used. They have recommended that the CDC prioritize healthcare workers and those who live in assisted living settings or congregate settings as the first priority for getting the vaccine. The next priority would be those who have chronic conditions who are much more likely to get really sick. Severe disease would be next, and then the general population. There is an expectation that as early as March of next year that the vaccines will be widely available. And you probably have heard the news stories today that both Moderna and Pfizer have agreed to produce another 100 million doses of their vaccines. The original deal with those companies required them to make 100 million doses available, but each of those 2 companies have now agreed to make another 100 million doses available. So we think that by March of next year, there's going to be tens of millions of vials of the vaccines available, so most of the people in the population can get vaccinated. So let me just say one last thing about why the vaccines were able to be developed so fast, because that's another question I get very often. It is true that 11 months to produce a vaccine is astonishingly fast. I will give you that. But there are some good reasons why we're able to do this so quickly. Number one, technology. The scientific advances in technology that have been brought to bear on COVID-19 are really amazing and incredible. Let me give you one example. The genome sequence for SARS-CoV-2 was published in early January, mid to early January. At least 3 companies had identified a vaccine candidate in about 30 days or so. So what used to take 1 or 2 years was accomplished in the span of a month because of the technology available to do so. The other thing that you should know is that none of the steps required to evaluate the vaccine, none of the phases, none of the processes have been omitted, but they've been run in parallel. So by having parallel processes versus sequential processes, we're able to shrink the timeline. And the last thing, which I think is very important, for the last 3 decades, an HIV vaccine has been the subject of intense research. And over that time period, a tremendous infrastructure has been developed to produce an HIV vaccine. So what actually happened was the HIV vaccine trials network became the COVID-19 vaccine trials network. So that pre-existing infrastructure leveraged our ability to move quickly. And these are 3 reasons, there are others, but these are 3 main reasons why the development could happen so fast versus other vaccines. So there are still challenges. One of the challenges, how do you manufacture, distribute equitably such large doses of the vaccine? As you know, these 2 vaccines have to be stored really cold, especially the Pfizer vaccine has to be stored at minus 94 degrees. That's a challenge. There's also a logistical challenge of getting 330 million people vaccinated with the vaccines. There's also an issue of what do you do ethically to make sure that people who really need it, in the order they need it, will get the vaccine. And then finally, one thing that's really, really important that we're trying to deal with is African Americans especially are skeptical, hesitant, mistrusting of what has happened, and they have every right to be. So we're owning the fact that if you're an African American, you, based on Tuskegee, Henrietta Lacks, in fact, atrocities have been visited upon black bodies in the United States since 1619 in the service of research in medicine. So we have every right to be mistrusting. But the science is solid, the science is just unparalleled. But you should also know that people who look like us have been involved in the process and sitting on all sides of the table. I can't not mention that a brilliant young black woman named Dr. Corbett, who works at the Vaccine Research Center at NIH, was a principal figure in making all of this possible. Many of you may not know that. If you don't know her, Google Corbett COVID-19, you'll get lots of hits. I'm an African American. I sit on the FDA committee that reviews the vaccines for approval. We have people, African Americans, sitting on the ACIP at CDC, making decisions about vaccine distribution. African Americans sat on the Data Safety Monitoring Board that on a regular basis monitored the trials to make sure that they were happening as they should be. So this is not Tuskegee. And the other thing to know about Tuskegee is that because of Tuskegee, human research changed forever. Informed consent became mandatory. Data safety monitoring boards became mandatory. So Tuskegee was horrible, there's no doubt about it, but because it happened, human research changed significantly for all time. So I think we can safely assume and accept that this is not Tuskegee. This is far from being Tuskegee. So let me close by saying the vaccines are on their way. They work really well, but we still got to do things to protect ourselves and our communities because it's going to be a while before we achieve herd immunity. So I'm pleading with you to maintain the mask wearing, the physical distancing, avoiding crowds. It's really important to avoid crowds right now because the level of virus in our community is really, really high. And the last thing we want to do is to be in a crowd. With or without a mask, I would not be in a crowd right now. And so the other thing is we have another virus circulating now. Influenza is circulating. So I encourage all of you, especially older individuals, to please get a flu shot so we don't have two illnesses that we're trying to deal with at the same time. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Now we're moving into the Q&A. First, let me say, Dr. Hildreth, thank you for such a great presentation. I have absolutely no desire to understand medical terms, but I really truly understood that presentation.
Thank you.
We have so many people watching, so many people asking questions, and thank you all for those who shared this, and we want to continue to invite you to write your comments and questions so we can engage you tonight. Dr. Hildreth, you already answered the first question around racial trauma. And it's a reality, and I really appreciate the way in which you answered it with compassion and dignity, because oftentimes it is dismissed, and it's really a reality, particularly in the medical field, the racial trauma. And that's one of the work we do here at Scarritt Bennett Center. So I want to ask another question, another first question, since you've also already answered the question around racial trauma. Talk to us a little bit about why while the vaccine is an individual decision, but it has a communal impact. This disease, right, while it's individually infecting folks, but it really has a communal. So this pandemic, this year, it is communal. So I want you to talk a little bit to us about why we need to be mindful about the individual decisions we make, how it impacts the community.
So people need to understand that in order for us to put the pandemic behind us, we have to achieve a certain level of population immunity to it. So in a way, when you get the vaccine, you're not doing something just for yourself. You're doing something for your larger community. And I view it as an act of self-love and community love for our people, love for our communities by doing this. But I know that the trauma, the reaction to all those things that we've been through is deep-seated and real. So we have to acknowledge that up front if we're going to deal with it. And I've tried my best to make sure people understand that I, being in the medical profession and a medical scientist, deeply appreciate the fact that so many people who look like me have that hesitation. But they really need to understand that things could not be more different now. The fact that we have so many people of color, not just on the scientific side, but the policy-making side, the review side. So I'm really, really pleased by that. And I think that going forward, nothing less will be acceptable, right? So there's been a sea change in this, and I think that's one of the consequences of the pandemic, is to make sure that going forward, nothing less than what has happened here will be acceptable.
That's right. Awesome. So we've had some pre-questions, people who wrote in their questions early on this week, and we have questions from the comments. Let me start with questions that we received from the Ask Meharry email. First question comes in, is asking, it is my understanding that a person who has received a COVID-19 vaccine may still get the virus, but symptoms are likely to be milder. Please confirm.
Yes, so the vaccines were designed to identify people who became infected and get disease, right? We can't actually say that the vaccines offer sterilizing immunity. That's a term we use in virology to mean that if the vaccine prevents infection completely, that would be a sterilizing immunity or sterilizing vaccine. That normally requires you to have high levels of an antibody called Ig alpha or IgA in your nose and respiratory tract. We can't say definitively that these vaccines have done that, but there are some studies underway at both Moderna and Pfizer to answer that question. And the way you answer that question is you take the vaccine recipients and you do serological analysis, but not for the spike protein, because the spike protein should be present in all of those who got the vaccine. But you look for an antibody to a different protein, for example, a nucleocapsid protein. If someone has an antibody to a nucleocapsid protein, that means they've been exposed to the virus and infected by it, even though they've gotten infected. Even though they've gotten the vaccine. So we suspect that we're not achieving sterilizing immunity, but the data is very clear that it's preventing disease. And preventing disease will save lives, and at the end of the day, that's the most important thing.
So all those who are receiving the vaccine now, they should still be wearing masks, they should still be taking precaution?
I think that until we are comfortable that we're almost at the point of herd immunity, I think the best advice would be to continue wearing the mask. We know that in both of these vaccines, about 7 days after the second dose, that's when the full protection seems to occur. But we know that between the first injection and the second injection, there's not full protection. So certainly between the first injection and the second injection, or 7 to 14 days after the second injection, people should definitely continue to wear their mask.
And for those who receive the vaccine, can they still be infected?
We can't say that they won't be infected, and the data won't allow us to say that. What we can say is that there's a 95% chance you're going to be protected from disease, which is what these vaccines were designed to do. So the trials are set up to answer specific questions. And preventing infection was not a specific question being asked in this trial. It was really designed to determine whether or not the vaccine could prevent disease. But there is evidence from the Moderna trial that, in fact, it did prevent asymptomatic infections, at least with some efficacy. But we got to do definitive studies on the vaccine recipients to know that that is the case.
There's a lot of questions that came in about pre-existing diseases, particularly in the African American community, sickle cell, immune diseases, lupus.
Right.
Would you talk a little bit about those folks who have these pre-existing diseases? How does this vaccine affect them?
So I think the Moderna and Pfizer did a great job of including people with comorbid conditions in their trial. Heart disease, there were some people with HIV that were included. Obese individuals were included. So I think they did a good job of looking at the range of comorbid conditions and trying to make sure that they were represented in the trial. And I really believe that if a person does not have a condition that impairs their immune response to a vaccine, they should receive the vaccine. There's no evidence whatsoever that someone with sickle cell some of the other diseases would be harmed by the vaccine. Because I think the Pfizer Moderna purposely included individuals with those conditions to make sure they worked. And as an aside, the minority participation in both trials was only about 10%, which is reasonable, but it could have been a lot better. But one of the things that gives me some assurance, even though they're not included, is the fact that we demonstrated that the vaccines do work in people with those conditions. Because we have a lot of people with those conditions, so it was really important to determine that they worked in those people. So that was a really good thing.
Yeah. Another question, a lot of questions that came in around allergies, people who use EpiPens, I'm allergic to penicillin, people who might be allergic to vaccines as a whole. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so between Moderna and Pfizer, something like 35,000 to 40,000 people received the vaccine candidate, and they rarely, if ever, saw any severe allergic reactions to them. But now that the vaccine has been given to this much larger number of people, it is not surprising that some people are having allergic reactions. I think it's fair to say that with most vaccines, when they're first introduced, we see some allergic reactions. So the recommendation is that if you have a history of allergic responses to medications or other allergies, you get the vaccine, but did you get it in a setting where if you have a reaction, it can be treated right away? So in other words, it's okay to get the vaccine if you have allergies, but do that in a setting where they can attend to you if you do have a reaction to the vaccine.
A lot of questions coming in from our comments. One more question from our email. This question came all the way from Zambia. We have an international reach of audience. So our sister from Zambia asks, is the vaccine for prevention or is it for those infected?
So if you have already been infected by the SARS-CoV-2, if you already had COVID-19, my advice would be to get the vaccine, because we know that there's evidence, there's data, clear data that people who get infected, get COVID-19, can get reinfected. What that means is that the immune response generated during the infection was not sufficient to offer protection. So I would advise anyone who's had COVID-19, they should also get the vaccine.
So questions from our audience tonight. There's been a lot of concerns around women's reproductive health. So would you talk a little bit about that? How will it affect women with reproductive health?
So usually when new drugs are being developed or new vaccines, you first establish safety in adults, healthy adults, normal adults. Once you've established that, you do bridging studies where you look in children and pregnant women. So those studies will happen now to make sure that these will be safe in women who are pregnant. But I can tell you that in both Moderna and Pfizer, women became pregnant during the study, during the vaccine study. Some of them withdrew from the trials, others stayed in. So we'll have some data. There's not a lot of women who became infected or who got the vaccine and became pregnant, but there are a number of them who did. So we'll have some data from those women, but the companies are now purposely evaluating whether or not the vaccine are safe in women who are pregnant and children. It's kind of the standard approach to developing new drugs.
Speaking of children, how young should children be in terms of taking the vaccine? Let's talk about children. How safe is this for children?
Well, as you know, currently children, even infants, currently get some vaccines, and one of the purposes of these bridging studies that are being done would be to evaluate both vaccines in toddlers all the way up to 12 or 18 years old. Pfizer cut off their study at age 16. Moderna cut off theirs at 18. So again, we have some data from a small number of late adolescents, but again, we have to do some studies designed to answer those questions in those populations.
There's a lot of talk, Dr. Hildreth, about a new strain reported in Europe. How does this vaccine protect patients from this new strain?
The truth is that we don't know with certainty that the vaccine will protect against this new strain called B1117 or something like that. And what has happened is SARS-CoV-2 as an RNA virus mutates as we knew it would. All RNA viruses have a certain rate of mutation or changes. And the mutations in this variant, many of them are in the spike protein, which is responsible for attachment and fusion. So mutations in that protein can affect the ability of the virus to infect or be transmitted. So that's why there's concern. What's happening now is, as we sit here and speak, they are taking plasma or serum from vaccine recipients and asking whether those antibodies neutralize this new variant. But I can tell you that in the preclinical studies that were done by both Moderna and Pfizer, they evaluated the antibodies generated to their vaccines to determine whether or not they would neutralize multiple strains of SARS-CoV-2, and the answer was yes. So there's some level of confidence that has to be proven that the vaccine will be effective against this variant. But the only way to demonstrate that is to take some antibodies from the vaccine recipients and test them against this new variant. And that's what's happening now as we speak.
For the one who's already been infected by COVID-19, would you talk a little bit about why they should be taking the vaccine? Are they immune to the virus?
Well, we know from the studies I alluded to earlier that quite a number of people who were infected got reinfected. And again, that probably means that their immune response to the virus during the infection was not sufficient to offer protection the next time they got exposed to the virus. And that is why, irrespective of whether you've been infected or not, the recommendation is that you get the vaccine, because we want to make sure that people are fully protected. It may well be that some people who got infected made a sufficient antibody response to be protective, but as I said earlier, we know that there's variations in how people respond to different things. And in fact, it's very likely that people who had a weaker response to the original strain of SARS-CoV-2 allowed the virus to mutate more so than it would normally. And that can be one of the reasons why variants accumulate, is that the immune response is limited in certain people.
You talked about in your presentation, Dr. Hildreth, about the 2 doses. Would you talk a little bit about why is there a difference in the days of getting the second dose? For the example, the 21 versus the 28 days.
I think that was a sort of a company decision. It was a decision made by the 2 pharma companies. So keep in mind that the phase 3 trials were preceded by phase 1, phase 2, and what I call preclinical studies. And the preclinical studies are done in animal models, non-human primates or mice, for example. And depending on whether or not you're using an adjuvant, the dose that you're using, that will determine the timing of your 2 doses. But to be honest, in my opinion, the Moderna vaccine could probably be given 21 days apart successfully, and conversely, the Pfizer vaccine could probably be given 28 days apart and still have success. But the thing is, you got to wait long enough for the primary response to wane, and then you give the second dose to get that really nice, beautiful secondary response. And that's what these 2 protocols are designed to do, is to give you that prime and a boost. And I think the timing, there's some latitude there.
So you talked in your presentation about why there are 2 doses in this vaccine. Talk to us for the one who don't go back and get the second one.
So it's really important that if you're going to get full protection from the vaccine, that second dose is critical, because as I said before, the response to the second dose is 100 times, sometimes even 1,000-fold higher than the first dose. But more importantly, that's when you establish those memory cells. And the memory cells in the immune system is what gives you long-lasting immunity. For example, the measles vaccine gives you lifelong protection. You can actually demonstrate that after you get that vaccine, there are memory cells in your body for as long as you live that remember, that can respond to that. So if you don't get that second injection, you won't have as many memory cells, and you won't be guaranteed to be protected. So by all means, you've got to get both shots.
So the flu shot is every year?
Yes.
This vaccine, is it forever like the measles, or talk to us about that?
Yeah, that's one thing that we really can't say definitively whether or not this will be a seasonal challenge, right? It's possible that if we achieve herd immunity through the vaccines and the immunity is long-lasting, it won't be a seasonal challenge. People need to know that influenza, the reason why you get a vaccine every year is the genome of influenza viruses is kind of like a deck of cards, and they can get shuffled every year to give you a unique combination of genes. And that's why every year in January or February, an international group of scientists get together and try to best predict which influenza we'll see that coming season. And then we try to make a vaccine to match that strain that we're predicting. This virus is not like that. It has a fairly stable, relatively speaking, genome, and we don't think there's going to be a need to generate multiple vaccines because the virus is changing so much like flu does.
Dr. Hildreth, you talked about this is a 2-year study.
Yes.
And so, there's a lot of conversations about the side effects.
Yes.
And people having, some concerns about harmful side effects. So would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, one of the reasons why the studies are designed to go 2 years is to have an adequate time to see any severe adverse effects, to see what they are and how to deal with those. So for the EUA, the emergency use authorization, the FDA required at least 2 months of follow-up for these 2 vaccines. The reason that's not arbitrary. The reason why they chose 2 months is that with most vaccines, if there's going to be a severe adverse reaction, you normally see that within about 6 weeks of giving the vaccine. And so I think with both of these vaccine candidates, most of the participants, we had 2 months of follow-up. And so the side effects were those you expect. Because keep in mind, we're trying to get the attention of the immune system. And when the immune system gets revved up, there are certain things that happen. Fever, headache, muscle aches, you can get swollen lymph nodes. That's a sign the immune system is working, swelling under the arm. So those things are pretty much predicted by the fact that you've gotten the immune system to respond to an antigen. But in terms of long-term sequelae from the vaccination, that is why the study is designed for 2 years. And let me just say that in the case of mRNA vaccines, the likelihood of seeing adverse events far out, which would be related to, sustained presence of the vaccine or changes in genes or something like that, they're very unlikely because, A, mRNA is not very antigenic because of the changes they've made to it. And second is, the mRNA itself only lasts for about 24 hours and then it gets destroyed. The protein that it makes stays in the cells for about 3 days, but the mRNA itself gets destroyed. There are no transcription sites, no integration sites, so it cannot change our DNA. So people need to know that. There's no chance that the mRNA can integrate or change our genes because they've taken steps to prevent that in how they design mRNA. So I think you can never say never, but it's very unlikely that beyond the few months that we have data for, that we're likely to see any major adverse side effects. But we're doing a 2-year study to make sure that that is the case. So no one can say definitively there won't be, but all the scientific evidence suggests that these 2 vaccines are extremely safe.
You are a well-respected scientist. You are a trusted voice in the medical field. But most importantly, you are a respected voice in our community. And so the people want to know tonight, what, if any, what are your concerns that you have about the vaccine?
To be quite honest with you, my biggest concern is that not enough people will accept the vaccine to achieve herd immunity, because that's how we get back to a new normal. And as a matter of fact, I got the vaccine myself today, this afternoon, because I'm totally confident that the vaccine is safe. And I want to be able to say, I'm not asking people to do something I've not done myself. So I felt it was very important that I stick my arm out and get that injection. I've already encouraged my older brother and sisters to get the vaccine because, again, to me, getting the vaccine is almost an act of self-love, but it's also an act of loving your community and your people. And if I had any doubts whatsoever, any reservations whatsoever, I would not recommend that people get the vaccine. But being on the FDA review committee where I had a chance to ask questions and see the data firsthand made me really confident that I can say with confidence that people should take the vaccine.
It came with great concern hearing that Meharry Medical College was not on the list of medical, in the medical, you all have been frontline all throughout the year in our community providing testing, and to hear that you were not part of the distribution of this vaccine. So the people want to know tonight, do y'all have what y'all need, or do we need to rise up?
No, you don't. There's no need. There's no need to rise up. There were certainly some communication issues, but I had a great conversation with Commissioner Piercy yesterday, and we now have in place all the plans we need to make sure that Meharry physicians and the frontline workers on the testing sites, as a matter of fact, the Meharians who work the test sites got their vaccines today. So all is well. No need to.
All right, because you know we will go to bat for you, Doc.
I understand, and believe me, we very much appreciate that.
Awesome. Talk a little bit about Meharry and the work you all have been doing this year, and also testing. So now that the vaccine is available for essential workers and frontline, and then at some point it'll be available to regular population,
Sure.
Should we still be testing? Talk a little bit about our practices
Sure.
During this vaccine distribution period.
So I'm not sure people know our story, so if you don't mind, I'll let people
Please.
know how Meharry came to be. Back in 1826, there was a young white teenage boy named Samuel Meharry driving a salt wagon. Actually, there was grist on the salt wagon, but that's a whole other thing. Anyway, he's driving his wagon through the backwoods. The wagon got stuck. He knocked on the door of this modest cabin in the distance, and a black family gave him a place to sleep, some food. Next morning, they helped him get on his way. And young Sam Meharry made a promise that if he ever had any means or resources, that he would do something for African Americans. And sure enough, 50 years later, in 1876, Samuel Meharry and his 4 brothers made a large gift to Central Tennessee College through the church to start a medical department. And that medical department became Meharry Medical College. So we were founded by an act of kindness and grace shown to this young man. He repaid that kindness and grace with a gift sufficient to create a unique institution. There's no other place. I'm not saying this just because I'm the president, but there's no other place quite like Meharry. And so we have it in our DNA, this spirit of service and making sure that people who need help get it. And back in March, when we saw that testing was going to be essential to deal with the pandemic, we made the decision to make sure that those without insurance, those who are not part of the patient panels of the large hospital systems, they would have access to testing. So as far as we were concerned, it was just part of our legacy, part of our purpose to do that. And that's what we've done. I can just tell you, I'm just so proud of what Meharians have done, how they stepped up to the plate. And we are now doing the testing for the city, been doing that for the last several months. Tens of thousands of people have been tested at those sites, and I think it's gone very well. But testing is still critical because, as I said earlier, you can't fight an enemy if you don't know where the enemy is. And the way you make an invisible enemy visible, you do the testing. That's why testing is so important, especially in those communities where the virus can do the most harm. So we want to make sure that people of color, minority communities can have access to testing, and it's still very important that we do this. So, and that's why we really embrace that, because it's a really important fight, part of the fight against the virus, and it's ravaging minority communities still.
That's right.
All over the country.
There's a lot of floating information out on the internet. So this is a 2-part. The first is, the request is that you repeat that there is no fetus remnants in the vaccine. But the second part is, for those who are watching, where are the places we can go to get proper information about the vaccine?
So I wanted to emphasize what's in the vaccine, and to repeat, this is a chemically well-defined vaccine compared to some others that include animal products or cellular products. There's a chemically synthesized messenger RNA, That is the blueprint for the spike protein. That is encapsulated in a shell of lipids. These are neutral lipids and charged lipids, along with some cholesterol. There's some sugar, sucrose, and it's reconstituted in saline. That is sodium chloride in water. There is no animal products. There are no cellular products. There are no heavy metals. There are no preservatives. That is all that is in that vial. And so it needs to be emphasized for all those who want to put those conspiracy theories out there. This is a chemically well-defined vaccine. We know exactly what's in there, and none of those things are present.
And where can the average person go to just get proper information?
So for those who are willing to do so, the FDA has on its website a lot of information about what these vaccines are, how they were tested. The videos of the review committee meetings, which lasted all day, are there for anybody to see. The CDC also has some great information about these vaccines and what they are. And you can also go to the websites of the companies, the sponsors, to find out what they are. And most of the academic health centers that have been involved in the vaccine studies, they also have a wealth of information about the vaccines. So I would just say that if it's one of the national organizations or academic health science centers, those are great places to get accurate, truthful information.
You talked during your presentation about storage. A question came in: why did Pfizer make the vaccine that required storage at extreme temperature? Can you talk a little bit about that?
The storage is determined by the nature of the vaccine itself. There are 4 major types of macromolecules that make up organic material. There are proteins, there are carbohydrates, there are lipids, and there are nucleic acids. And those are the major categories. And because of the nature of those things, that determines how stable they are. And it turns out that of all those things I named, messenger RNA is fairly unstable. And in order to make sure that the vaccines can be stored and remain stable and active, that determines why they have to be stored at such low temperatures. It's the inherent nature of the mRNA itself. So, if Pfizer had their way, they would not have to be stored that way, and I understand they're working on a 2nd-generation vaccine that does not have to be stored at such a temperature. But the challenge there is, how do you make a blueprint mRNA molecule that can still be a blueprint, but you chemically modified it to be more stable? And that's a challenge that the scientists at both places, Moderna and Pfizer, are tackling right now, making a more stable mRNA that can still do its job of serving as a blueprint for the protein.
Yeah. So we talked about vulnerable populations, but we have not talked about the elderly community. My mother is 79, she'll be 80. So let's talk a little bit about how this affects the elderly community.
So again, I was very pleased that in both the case of Moderna and Pfizer, they included a number of individuals who are older than 65. In fact, in both studies, there are people older than 80 years old. And so we confirmed that across all those age groups, the youngest in the study and the oldest in the study, the efficacy was the same. So again, we had to be sure that the vaccine worked in elderly populations, and Pfizer and Moderna did a reasonably good job of making sure they had those persons included in the study. Now typically, with some vaccines, you require a higher dose in elderly patients because the immune system starts to wane a bit. So you have to, like flu, for example, there are a lot of flu vaccines. There's a higher dose given to elderly folks versus younger people because you need a bigger jolt of the immune system. But in the case of these 2 vaccines, it was determined that the doses used were effective across all the age groups.
The question that just came in is, we've talked a lot about the vaccine being available to essential workers and frontline. Do you have an idea of when it will be open and ready for the public?
The best estimate, and I mean, this is all going to be determined by how fast the drug companies can manufacture the millions of vials that are needed. But probably by March or April, if things go well, if the logistics hold and they can produce enough of the vaccine, certainly by the early summer, I think most of the population should see vaccine being available to them. One of the challenges, again, is the storage, the fact that you need 2 doses for each person. As part of the Operation Warp Speed deal with the drug companies, they were obliged to produce 100 million doses and make that available. So now for Moderna and Pfizer, they've gone back to order 100 million more doses. So there's going to be 400 million doses of vaccine available. That is enough for 200 million people. So that would be a huge chunk of the population. And then, of course, they could order more of those vaccines later. But right now, there's definitive plans for 400 million doses to be delivered by early summer. So I think that's pretty good.
And can you choose which sponsor the drug comes from?
I'm not sure that it's necessary to choose because both of these vaccines are mRNA based. The trial data is very similar. And as a matter of fact, from my point of view as a scientist, we have 2 vaccines made with the same platform, same protocol that was used for the study, same more or less profile of participants, and the results came out strikingly similar, which means that these 2 studies kind of reinforce each other. They kind of confirm each other. So I don't think that there's anything to choose between them. And so I wouldn't hesitate to take the Moderna or the Pfizer because both of them are very safe, both of them are very effective. So I don't think people should worry about which of those 2 they're going to get.
So we saw in Thanksgiving season, Thanksgiving holiday, or after the Thanksgiving holiday, the numbers have spiked. And here we're entering into the Christmas holiday. We learned that Tennessee is #1 in the world in terms of infections. Could you talk a little bit about why, particularly in Tennessee, because this is the risk state, right? People are told not to travel in Tennessee because it's not a safe state. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think it's really unfortunate that we find ourselves in that unenviable position of being, leading the country in terms of COVID-19. But the science is clear, and it was predicted that if we had large numbers of people congregating inside, not wearing a mask and not doing physical distancing, the result was going to be a surge in cases. It all goes back to what I said earlier. This is a truly airborne pathogen that some studies say that it can be projected as far as 25 feet away from the person who is speaking. You don't have to cough, you don't have to sneeze. Just a normal conversation is sufficient to aerosolize the virus, and someone can inhale the virus that you've exhaled. So if we have the same thing happening over Christmas, large numbers of people gathering with folks outside of their bubble, right, we're going to see the same thing happen. But keep in mind that the level of the surge is determined by where you start from. We're starting from a much higher level of virus now than we did before. So the potential for this surge is really, really scary because there's so much virus out there, and we have, I don't know what the positive rate was. The positive rate the other day was an astounding 30%. Imagine that 1 out of 3 people who test are positive. That's really scary, right? And as I point out to people, there's good data to suggest that for every PCR diagnosed case, there are several others that go undiagnosed, which means that there could be people out there spreading the virus, not intentionally, they're just not aware that they're doing so. And that's why my advice for this Christmas would be to celebrate it with people in your immediate bubble or pod and do the virtual FaceTime, whatever you call that, to celebrate with your family. And that way, next Christmas, we'll all be able to get together. And if we don't do that, I'm afraid that next Christmas there are going to be some empty seats at the table.
Yeah. There's a lot of anxiety about going back to what was. Would you talk a little bit about the new normal?
Well, I think that for some time, even after vaccines are widely available, there's going to be a level of apprehension of people saying, are we really done with this? Are we really past this, right? And that's only natural. But I'm hoping that some of the habits we've learned or some of the things that we've learned can be applied going forward to reduce the level of respiratory disease, because flu is still out there. And I think that this is not the last pandemic we're going to see. So I really think that the new normal will be us all being much more conscious of the fact that we can become infected by respiratory viruses, and we'll take steps to protect ourselves. But I also think this will teach some lessons about just how wide the gap in health is among the population in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we spend $3.5 trillion a year on health care, but we don't rank among the top 10 healthiest nations in the world. And I would think that just 10% of that, $350 billion, spent on preventive medicine and health education would have profound impact on our population. So I'm really hoping that one of the things that will come out of this is a renewed focus on public health and how important it is. Mm-hmm. I also hope that our renowned institutions, the CDC and the FDA, will be unfettered, because they are the premier institutions that are of their kind in the world. Mm-hmm. And just quite frankly, over the last several months, they've been handcuffed by politics. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping they'll be freed up to do what they do better than any other organizations in the world.
Mm-hmm. Here's an interesting question that came in. If someone not in the frontline category to get the vaccine and gets infected or very ill from COVID-19, will they be given the vaccine immediately, and will it work?
The vaccines are not usually therapeutic, because someone who's really ill with COVID-19, for example, the vaccine is designed to produce the spike protein of the virus. If you're already infected and the virus is replicating, the spike protein is already in your system. Mm. And it's not obvious that producing more spike protein would do anything to enhance your immune response. As a matter of fact, if you have made antibodies to the spike protein and you get a vaccine that produces spike protein, those pre-made antibodies might bind to and eliminate the spike protein and prevent a further response in the first place. Mm. So I don't think these vaccines are designed to be therapeutic. And I doubt that giving a vaccine to someone who's already dealing with COVID-19 might be effective, given the fact that, again, spike protein is already there. The preformed antibodies might mop it up and prevent any further response. Mm-hmm.
Is it true that we know a little bit more about COVID-19 and that it's helpful for someone who is infected now versus back in March?
Oh, no question.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think the physicians who take care of COVID-19 patients deserve a lot of credit, because the death rate or the death from COVID-19 has been substantially reduced, because physicians, as they do, when they deal with something, often they get better and better at treating it, and that's been the case with COVID-19. Steroids have been important. There are other things that they've done in terms of when to put people on ventilators and when to intubate, all that. So the treatment of COVID-19 is vastly improved than it was in the beginning, because, again, we had never dealt with it before, but I think the physicians who take care of the patients have gotten really much better at treating COVID-19. And again, many fewer people are dying simply because the physicians who take care of them are much better at doing so.
Mm-hmm. Here's a comment that came in. Part of our work is shifting and changing the minds of people when you get more information. So want to share this comment. There are so many people of color who are not convinced of the vaccine. This information tonight is so helpful. My veteran husband had mentioned taking the vaccine. Dr. Hildreth has provided me information needed. When my time comes to take the vaccine, I will be in line.
Awesome.
So we're really glad to hear that.
Awesome.
A question about tracking the vaccine. How does one get the vaccine and how will it be tracked?
So that's a very good question. And there's a robust national system that's already established for monitoring vaccine recipients. But in addition to that pre-existing system, there's something called vSafe. When you get the vaccine, you'll be able to, it's an app you put on your phone. It's kind of a journal you can keep, so that if there's an adverse event, it can be immediately reported to the CDC as a way to monitor how well the vaccine is being tolerated. So people need to know that there's a pre-existing network or system for monitoring vaccine recipients, but on top of that, there's this new system called vSafe that further expands our ability to quickly know when something is wrong, that it can be taken care of. So those folks who get allergic responses, that will be picked up immediately. And again, we're advising that if you have a history of allergies, you get your vaccine in a setting where it can be dealt with clinically right away. Mm-hmm. But there is a really robust, if you go to the CDC website, you'll actually see a full description of this system, including vSafe that I described, which is a new component of it.
So let's I want to piggyback from the comment. If you're watching tonight and this information has been helpful and it changed your mind for some reason, go ahead and put in the comments that you plan on taking a vaccine. We want to know that we're doing our part. Dr. Hildreth want to know that he is doing his part to shift the narrative and to work with the community, to support the community, to make the best decision for our community. So let me invite you, if you haven't already, would you comment about your plans in taking the vaccine? Dr. Hildreth, I want to put you on the spot a little bit, but I think you can handle it. I want you to talk to the pastors tonight who, might live in a state where there are no restrictions. And here's Christmas. Christmas is a huge part of our tradition in church. So talk to the families who want to celebrate Christmas and they live in a state where there's not much restrictions. Will you talk to the people tonight, leaders tonight, about why it's important, while they might not have restrictions from the state, but why it's important for us to do our part to keeping our community, our family safe?
So whether you live in a state with restrictions or no, and right now across the whole United States, even those states that have restrictions, some of them have relaxed those restrictions, the virus is running rampant. And what I'd like to say is it's incumbent upon all of us who want to protect our communities and our families to take personal responsibility to do our part. And as I said earlier, the virus can be transmitted pre-symptomatically or asymptomatically, so you don't really know always who the person is with the virus. They may not even know. But if all of us are wearing a mask, it won't matter who the infected person is, we can disrupt the chain of transmission and keep the virus from spreading. That's especially important in some of our communities and families, because we live in multi-generational households where there are older individuals, many of whom have these chronic conditions. Right. And the last thing we want to do is to bring the virus home to one of them, because I've heard too many stories of a younger person who maybe didn't take this quite as seriously as they might have, who unfortunately brought the virus home to an elderly relative, and that person didn't do very well. So I would just say to the pastors that they should really encourage their congregations or the people that they lead to take the virus seriously. It is still a huge problem. And this is a relentless pathogen. It does not discriminate. That's right. It doesn't care if you are Catholic, Baptist, whatever you might be, male, female, 2 years old, 102-year-olds. It really does not care. If you're a human being living and breathing with normal cells that we all have, this virus will infect you, and under certain conditions it will kill you. And to those young people who think that they're impervious to the virus, I have a message for you. There are plenty of 20-year-olds who've died, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50. Then there's no way to predict who that will be. So I'm really encouraging everybody, regardless of who you are, Republican, Democrat, in between, we need to take the virus seriously, because we don't know who will get sick. We really can't say that definitively, who will get sick and who will die, regardless of your age.
More questions are coming in. There's been some conversations about vitamin D. There's a study that came out to say that people with vitamin D deficiencies showed up in terms of dying. Would you talk a little bit about that?
I think the data now is pretty good that vitamin D deficiency leads to worse outcomes with COVID than people who have normal levels. And unfortunately, there are a lot of African Americans who do not have sufficient levels of vitamin D. And there's a recommendation that we make sure we do have good levels of vitamin D is an important cofactor in some functions of the immune system. And that is why vitamin D deficiencies are not necessarily a good thing. So we can either eat a healthy diet to get the vitamin D, spend some time outside in the glorious sunshine, or you do what I do. I take a multivitamin every single day. Mm-hmm. I do have a healthy diet and all that, but just to be absolutely sure, because I'm in the older category now, I take a multivitamin every day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Would you talk a little bit about, you talked about vitamins, but what can we do beside the vaccine, right, to keep our health intact, right? What are we eating, vitamins, all of that?
So the immune system consists of cells that are constantly turning over. And in our body, for those kinds of organs that have constant turnover, the GI tract is one example, where the cells are constantly turning over. That requires nutrients to make sure that those proteins and factors that are needed for the growth of those cells, that they are present. So one of the most important things to have your immune system be healthy and functional is a balanced, healthy diet. I cannot emphasize how important that is.
Yeah.
And so for those individuals who want to make sure that their immune system functions well, my strongest recommendation would be to make sure you're having a good, healthy diet, getting some exercise, because all those things that you lower your stress. Stress is bad news when it comes to your immune system.
Yeah.
One example that people may know is that oftentimes when people are really stressed, they tend to get cold fever blisters or cold sores. Mm-hmm. What keeps those from happening is your immune system suppresses that virus and keeps it in check. But when you're really stressed, the immune system kind of falls off, and that's a manifestation of it. So stress is a really bad thing in terms of immune function, so try to keep your stress levels low.
Yeah. So there was a question earlier when you talk about stress. A lot of people relieve stress by going to the gym, exercising. That's hard to do now. You know, it's cold outside, can't really go to the gym. So talk a little bit about that.
So I think if the gym or the fitness center takes appropriate precautions for people to maintain their distance, you got to have routine sanitization of all the equipment because people are sweating, touching. So I think it's okay to go to those places, but make sure they're doing all the things necessary to keep you safe when you're there.
Dr. Hildreth, there's a lot of questions that came around people who are on immune supplements. Would you talk a little bit about that?
So again, I think it's okay to use those kinds of supplements that are meant to bolster the immune system. But I'm going to come back to what I said earlier. You must have a balanced, nutritious diet. Without that, your immune system won't be up to its peak function. And again, whatever you can do to keep your stress levels low, please do that. Mm-hmm. Some of these supplements have marginal benefits, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend them. But I do think that vitamins are important, and that can never do any harm.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'm looking at the time, and we have spent this time really well. And I want to give you an opportunity to offer closing remarks as we leave this space to our community. And again, our community has reached internationally. It's not just Nashville. There's so many people who are watching tonight all over the country and even world. And so again, let me say, on behalf of Scarritt Bennett Center, we are so grateful to partner with Meharry Medical College. And on behalf of Nashville, we are so grateful to have you be part of our community here, right here in Nashville. You are the best of the best, and we're grateful that you would take your time. You've been on CNN and all that, and here you are right here taking care of your own community. So we appreciate you. We appreciate your genius, your work, but most of all, we appreciate your leadership in our community. We're grateful. So I want to turn it over to you, that you might offer closing remarks as we leave this space.
So today, as I sat there getting my injection of the vaccine, it occurred to me what a remarkable moment we find ourselves in. And as a scientist, knowing that this protein, this substance, messenger RNA, was discovered 60 years ago, the scientists who discovered it could not have known that so many decades later, their discovery would be key to putting this global crisis behind us. I mean, there are going to be other vaccines made from other platforms, but my point is, science has provided a solution to a problem that has made the whole world stand still. And one of the things that really perplexes me and has perplexed me from the beginning is those who would like to reject science and scientists. Our motivation is quite simple. We'd like to do the work, make discoveries that will change the world and make lives better. And I think as an African American scientist especially, to be a part of a solution of a problem that's been so devastating to us. As I sat there and got that vaccine injected, it was really a sobering moment for me. And I want people to know that the scientists involved, we're all driven by insatiable curiosity. We want to find answers to questions. And in this case, the question was, what can we do to put this behind us? And the answer is the vaccine. So to be even a small part of that was a real amazing moment for me. But people need to know that the end is in sight, but the end won't come unless the majority of us believe in the science, trust the science. And to the people of color who might be watching, this is not Tuskegee. Tuskegee was horrible. It really was. I mean, when I think about it, it makes me angry just thinking about it, that you had 600 black men who were led to believe they're being treated for something. They were never treated at all. Even when penicillin became available in 1945, they were not given it. So it's just a horrible example of lapse of ethics and mistreatment that prompted a sitting president, to apologize for it. But this is not that. It is so far removed from that. It's amazing to think how different things are. So I just want to say that for me as a scientist, what a great day this was to sit there and get the vaccine, and to know that it is the answer to the problem that we're facing for all of us, no matter who you are. I would just say, let's trust the science, let's love each other, and by loving each other, that means let's do our part to put this behind us. And for me, that means getting vaccinated. And what I'm trying to do is to empower people to make the decision on their own. Because one of the things that we didn't have in Tuskegee was the agency to make that decision. So I'm not trying to coerce anybody into anything. My goal is to give you enough information, because people are intelligent, they have free will. I want to give them enough information that they feel comfortable making that decision. It's their decision. We have the power to choose, and I want to make sure there's enough information that people will choose to accept the vaccine. So, and thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts tonight.
Thank you again, Dr. Hildreth, and I want to thank the staff that's behind the scenes at Meharry and Scarritt to make this possible tonight. And for all of you tuning in tonight, thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing this. We encourage you and invite you to continue these conversations with family and friends. You might say something that changed someone's mind that will save many lives. So please continue these conversations, and happy holidays to you. May you have a safe social distancing time with your family and friends. God bless you. Bye-bye.